she mouthed. "Help me at the red light." A Hell's Angel followed the car for 67 miles. The red light on Highway 47 saved Adelaide Weaver's life. At 82 years old, with moderate dementia clouding her days like morning fog, she still recognized terror when it gripped her heart. As her son's sedan idled at the intersection, she turned her head toward the motorcycle rumbling beside them and pressed her trembling fingers against the window. Her lips formed two silent words that would change everything. "Help me." Granite saw it. At 55, with 27 years in the brotherhood and a mother in assisted living, he knew the difference between confusion and fear. He'd seen both in his own mother's eyes during her lucid moments. What he witnessed in this elderly woman's face wasn't the blank bewilderment of dementia. It was pure, desperate terror. The light changed. The sedan pulled forward. And Granite made a decision that would span 67 miles and uncover a web of abuse, theft, and family betrayal that had been hidden behind legal documents and forced smiles. Adelaide had taught music at Riverside Elementary for 40 years. She'd guided hundreds of children through scales and recitals, teaching them rhythm by tapping out patterns on her desk. She'd been sharp as a tack until 3 years ago, when her husband died and the fog began rolling in. The dementia was moderate, some days clear, some days clouded, but never so severe that she'd lost herself entirely. She still played piano in her living room. She still remembered the names of students from decades past. She still knew when something was terribly, dangerously wrong. And today, everything was wrong. Her son had arrived at her house that morning with his wife and packed bags Adelaide didn't remember packing. "Just a visit to a nice place, Mom," he'd said, his voice too bright, too cheerful. "You'll love it. They have activities and everything." But Adelaide had lived through 82 years of reading people's faces. Her son was lying. In her clearer moments, and this had been one of them, she'd understood what was happening. She'd seen the papers he'd been having her sign over the past months, always during her foggy times, always when she could barely remember her own address. She'd discovered, just 2 weeks ago during a rare, completely lucid day, that her house was being prepared for sale, that her bank accounts had been transferred, that she'd apparently signed power of attorney documents she had no memory of signing. She'd tried to call her grandson then, her beautiful Felix, her daughter's son, who'd always understood her. But her phone had been disconnected. "To save you money, Mom," her son had explained. "You kept forgetting to pay the bill." She hadn't forgotten. She'd been paying that bill for 30 years. Now they were driving, her son and his wife in the front seats, Adelaide trapped in the back with her door locked from the outside. Child safety locks. At 82 years old, she was being transported like a child. The familiar streets of Riverside passed by her window, the town where she'd lived for half a century, where she'd taught generations of children, where everyone knew her name, or used to know her name. These past 3 years, as the fog came and went, she'd become invisible. Just another confused old woman. Her son had made sure of that, spreading word that her dementia was severe, that she couldn't be trusted, that any complaints she made were just the confused ramblings of a deteriorating mind. But Adelaide's mind wasn't deteriorating, not entirely. Not yet. And in this moment, as her son drove her away from everything she knew towards some facility 3 hours away, her mind was crystal clear. They were taking her away to hide her, to silence her, to lock her up somewhere remote where no one who knew her would ever visit. And once she was there, once the house was sold and the accounts were emptied, she would simply disappear into the fog for real. At the red light on Highway 47, where her old neighborhood gave way to the interstate entrance, Adelaide had spotted the motorcycle. The rider was large, bearded, wearing leather and patches. The kind of man her generation had been taught to fear. The kind of man society said was dangerous. But Adelaide had spent 40 years reading people, and what she saw in that moment wasn't danger. She saw awareness. She saw someone who was actually looking at her, really seeing her, not looking through her the way everyone else did these days. She pressed her hand to the window, made eye contact, mouthed the words, "Help me." Granite's day had started like any Sunday. He'd visited his mother at Pine Ridge Assisted Living, where she resided in the memory care unit. She'd had a good day, recognized him, held a full conversation about his father's Navy service, reminded him that he'd promised to bring her those butter cookies she liked. Days like that were precious. Days like that made the hard days bearable. He'd been heading home, taking the scenic route through Riverside because the weather was perfect and the highway could wait. His own mother's situation had made him acutely aware of the elderly, especially those whose minds were slipping. He'd learned to spot the difference between dementia's confusion and actual distress. His mother sometimes forgot where she was, but she was never afraid. She was cared for, protected, safe. The woman in the sedan was afraid. Granite didn't overthink it. 27 years in the brotherhood had taught him to trust his instincts. When the light changed and the sedan turned toward the interstate, he followed. The sedan's driver seemed oblivious at first. Granite kept 2 cars back, professional, patient. He pulled out his phone and called Wraith, his chapter's communications specialist. "Need you to run a plate for me," he said, reciting the numbers. "Something's not right." Traffic was light for a Sunday afternoon. The sedan maintained exactly the speed limit, heading north on I-47. Granite followed, his mind cataloging details. The woman in the back seat kept turning to look out the rear window. Not at him specifically. She probably couldn't even see him behind the other vehicles, but searching, desperate, like someone looking for help that might not come. They passed the Riverside town limits. The sedan continued north. Granite's phone buzzed. "Got something interesting," Wraith said. "Vehicle registered to a Philip Whitlock, age 54. But here's the thing. His mother, Adelaide Weaver, was reported missing 3 weeks ago by a grandson. Case was closed when Philip showed up with guardianship papers." "The woman in the back seat," Granite said. "Elderly, 82. Retired music teacher. Taught at Riverside Elementary for 40 years. Granite's jaw tightened. "Find the grandson now." They passed mile marker 15, then 20. The sedan showed no sign of stopping. Granite maintained his distance, but his mind was racing. A missing person report, guardianship papers that closed a case. An elderly woman who looked terrified being driven away from her hometown by her own son. He'd seen this before. Not personally, but in the news, in stories, in the quiet warnings shared at the community center where his mother lived. Elder abuse. Financial exploitation. Adult children who saw their aging parents as assets to be liquidated rather than people to be protected. At mile marker 32, they passed through Adelaide's old hometown of Millbrook. The sedan slowed slightly as it went through the downtown area. Granite watched as the woman in the back seat pressed both hands against the window, her mouth open as if she was crying out. Her head swiveled, following familiar landmarks. The old high school where she'd probably taught music classes, the community center, the church with the tall white steeple. This was her geography, her lifetime. And she was being driven through it like a prisoner in transport. Granite's phone buzzed again. "Got him," Wraith said. "Felix Drummond, 28 years old. Adelaide's grandson from her daughter's side. He's been filing complaints about his father for months, claiming financial abuse, forged documents, the works. Says he's been trying to locate his grandmother since his uncle blocked his access. I've got his number. Call him," Granite said. "Tell him to meet us at—" He paused, checking the highway signs. "Tell him we're northbound on I-47, currently passing Millbrook. Find out where this sedan is headed and get him there. Already on it. According to the guardianship papers, she's being transferred to Meadowbrook Care Facility. It's about 30 miles ahead, just outside Preston." Granite knew Preston. Small town, rural, isolated. He also knew that care facilities in remote areas often had the worst inspection records. Places where wealthy families could stash elderly relatives they didn't want to deal with. Where understaffing and neglect were common. Where someone could disappear. "Find out everything you can about that facility," Granite ordered. "And get me the local sheriff's name for Preston." They continued north. The landscape changed from suburban sprawl to farmland. The sedan maintained its steady pace. Granite watched as Adelaide's agitation increased. She was tapping on the window now, a rhythmic pattern. 3 short taps, 3 long taps, 3 short taps. Granite's father had been Navy. His father had taught him Morse code as a boy, explained how it had saved lives in the Pacific. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. This woman, this former music teacher with dementia, was tapping out an SOS signal against the window. The pieces clicked together in Granite's mind. She'd taught rhythm to children. She was using that rhythm now to call for help in the only way she could. He called Wraith back. "Tell the grandson his grandmother is tapping SOS in Morse code. She's lucid. She knows what's happening to her." There was a pause on the other end. "Christ," Wraith said quietly. "I'm expediting everything. Felix Drummond is on his way." He was already in Preston following a lead. "He'll be at Meadowbrook before you get there." "And Granite? That facility has 17 violations on record. It's exactly the kind of place where someone could vanish." At mile marker 53, the sedan took the Preston exit. Granite followed, no longer bothering to stay hidden. He wanted them to know he was there, wanted whoever was driving that car to understand they were being watched. The sedan's brake lights flickered. It slowed, then sped up slightly. The driver had noticed him. Good. They wound through Preston's small downtown, a collection of weathered storefronts and empty lots. The sedan turned onto rural Route 9, heading into genuine countryside. Granite kept pace, his motorcycle rumbling a promise behind them. 3 miles outside town, the sedan pulled into a long driveway leading to a sprawling single-story building. The sign read, "Meadowbrook Care Facility" in faded letters. The grounds were overgrown. The building's paint was peeling. This wasn't a care facility. This was a warehouse for forgotten people. Granite pulled into the parking lot as the sedan stopped near the entrance. He watched as a middle-aged man emerged from the driver's seat, well-dressed, corporate-looking, the kind of man who smiled for cameras and hid cruelty behind respectability. The wife got out of the passenger side, equally polished, equally false. They opened the back door and tried to hurry Adelaide out of the vehicle. She resisted, her feet dragging, her hands clutching the door frame. She was crying now, shaking her head, her mouth forming words that Granite couldn't hear but could easily imagine. He dismounted and walked toward them. The man, Philip, turned, his expression shifting from rushed efficiency to defensive hostility. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Granite said calmly. "You can explain why that woman was tapping SOS in Morse code for the last 30 miles. Philip's face went pale, then flushed red. "This is none of your business. This is my mother, and she has dementia. She doesn't know what she's doing. She knows Morse code," Granite said. "She taught it to music students as rhythm exercises, and she's been using it to call for help. She's confused." The wife, Connie, interjected, her voice sharp. "She doesn't understand that we're helping her. This is for her own good." "Is it?" Granite took another step closer. "Because from where I was riding, it looked like kidnapping. How dare you?" Philip started, his voice rising. The rumble of motorcycle engines cut him off. Granite smiled. "I made some calls during the drive. A dozen motorcycles rounded the corner and pulled into the parking lot, forming a semicircle around the sedan. The Brotherhood had come. Hammer was there, solid and unmovable. Wraith had ridden out himself. Bishop had brought 3 prospects. They stood, silent and imposing, a wall of leather and judgment. Adelaide stopped struggling. She turned toward the motorcycles, her eyes wide, and then she looked at Granite. Her expression shifted from fear to something like hope. "Mrs. Weaver," Granite said gently, addressing her directly for the first time. "I'm going to make a call now. We're going to figure out what's really going on here. Would that be all right with you?" Adelaide nodded, her hands still clutching the car door frame. "I taught music," she said, her voice thin but clear, "for 40 years. At Riverside Elementary. I have students everywhere. They would help me if they knew." The clarity in her voice silenced everyone. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't dementia-fueled paranoia. This was a woman who understood exactly what was happening to her. Granite pulled out his phone and dialed the number Wraith had provided. "Sheriff's Office, Preston County," a voice answered. "This is Granite, calling from Meadowbrook Care Facility on rural Route 9. I need a sheriff out here immediately. I've witnessed what appears to be elder abuse in progress, and I've got questions about some guardianship papers that were used to close a missing person case." "Who is this?" the voice demanded. "Tell Sheriff Dawson that one of Adelaide Weaver's former students needs his help." There was a pause. "Adelaide Weaver?" "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll be right there." Granite lowered the phone and looked at Philip, whose face had gone from red to white. He knows her, doesn't he? Sheriff Dawson. He was one of her students. Adelaide's face lit up with recognition. Tommy, she said softly. Tommy Lansing. He was in my class in 1988. He always had trouble keeping rhythm until I taught him the SOS pattern. He used to tap it on his desk. The wife grabbed Philip's arm. We have legal guardianship, she hissed. They can't stop us. Those papers won't hold up if they were signed during diminished capacity, Granite said. Or if they were forged. And judging by that expression on your face, I'm guessing it's one or the other. A young man came running from the facility's parking lot, his face desperate and relieved all at once. Grandma! Adelaide turned, and her entire body sagged with relief. Felix. Felix Drummond pushed past Philip and wrapped his arms around his grandmother. I've been looking for you for 3 months, he said, his voice breaking. I knew something was wrong. I knew Uncle Philip was lying. He took everything, Adelaide said, and her voice was perfectly clear, perfectly lucid. The house, the accounts. He had me sign papers when I couldn't remember my own name. When I finally had a clear day and realized what he'd done, he took my phone. He told everyone my dementia was worse than it is. He made me disappear. We're trying to help her, Philip insisted, but his voice had lost its conviction. A sheriff's cruiser pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. The door opened, and a man in his early 40s stepped out. He took one look at Adelaide and stopped dead. Mrs. Weaver? Adelaide smiled through her tears. Hello, Tommy. You came. Sheriff Dawson, who'd been Tommy Lansing in Adelaide's 5th grade music class, looked from Adelaide to Philip to the assembled motorcycles. Someone want to tell me what's going on here? What followed was 3 hours of questioning, document examination, and phone calls. Felix had brought copies of his complaints, financial records that showed suspicious transfers, and a timeline of his uncle's actions. Adelaide, during a sustained period of lucidity, gave a statement that was heartbreakingly clear about what had been done to her. The guardianship papers were examined. They'd been notarized during a period when Adelaide's doctor's notes showed she'd been experiencing a particularly severe fog. The doctor, not Adelaide's regular physician, but one Philip had taken her to specifically for the signing, had noted patient appears confused and disoriented in the medical record. These won't hold up in court, Sheriff Dawson said. Not with this pattern of behavior and the timing of everything. Philip and Connie were arrested on preliminary charges of elder abuse and financial exploitation. The investigation would take months, but the evidence was damning. Bank records showed hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred from Adelaide's accounts to Philip's. Property records showed the house deed had been transferred 2 weeks ago. Adelaide's regular doctor, when contacted, was horrified. She'd been asking about her patient and been told by Philip that Adelaide had been moved out of state for family care. As the sun set over the Meadowbrook facility parking lot, Adelaide sat in Sheriff Dawson's cruiser, wrapped in a blanket, with Felix holding her hand. The facility was being inspected based on the tip that someone had been preparing to commit an elderly woman there against her will. Granite stood with his brothers, watching the scene unfold. Adelaide turned and looked at him through the cruiser's window. She mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." He nodded once. That was all that was needed. 3 months later, the legal battles were still ongoing, but the outcome was never in doubt. Philip had forged documents, manipulated Adelaide during her vulnerable moments, and systematically stolen her life's savings. With Felix as her legal representative and Adelaide's regular doctor confirming that her dementia was moderate, not severe, that she had lucid periods, and should never have been declared incapable, the case against Philip was solid. Adelaide moved in with Felix, who'd turned his spare bedroom into a comfortable suite for her. On her good days, she played piano. On her foggy days, Felix sat with her and reminded her that she was safe, that she was home, that no one would take her away again. And once a week, Granite visited. They played dominoes at Felix's kitchen table, and Adelaide would tell stories about her students, her years teaching music, her husband who'd loved her for 56 years before the cancer took him. "I knew you would help," she told Granite one afternoon, her hands steady as she placed a domino. "When I saw you at that red light, I knew." "How?" Granite asked. "Because you looked at me," Adelaide said simply. "Really looked at me. Most people don't see the elderly anymore. We become invisible. But you saw me. You saw that I was still here, still me, still worth saving. The final domino fell on a Saturday evening 6 months after the red light on Highway 47. The Riverside Community Center was hosting its annual spring concert, featuring current music students from Riverside Elementary. It was a tradition Adelaide had started 40 years ago. This year she sat in the front row, with Felix on one side and Granite on the other. Behind them, scattered throughout the audience, were half a dozen members of the Brotherhood. Men who'd never thought they'd attend an elementary school concert. Men who looked entirely out of place in their leather and patches, surrounded by proud parents and grandparents. But as the children performed, as the young voices rose in familiar melodies, something remarkable was revealed. When the concert ended and the students flooded into the audience to greet their families, 3 of them ran straight to the Angels. Hammer's daughter, in 4th grade, threw her arms around her father's waist. "Did you see me, Dad? Did you see?" "Every second, sweetheart," Hammer said, his gruff voice going soft. Wraith's nephew performed a piano solo that had the whole audience applauding, and Bishop's grandson, just 6 years old, had sung in the choir with enthusiasm that exceeded his accuracy. The community center's director made her way to Adelaide as the crowd began to disperse. "Mrs. Weaver, it's so wonderful to have you here. So many of your former students wanted to thank you personally. And they came. A lawyer who'd found his love of rhythm in her classroom. A doctor who'd learned discipline through piano lessons. A teacher who'd been inspired by Adelaide's patience. And Sheriff Tommy Dawson, who'd driven from Preston just to see his old teacher at the concert she'd founded. You taught me more than music," he told her, crouching beside her chair. "You taught me to pay attention, to listen for the patterns that other people miss. That signal you were tapping, I would have recognized it if I'd been there, because you taught it to me." Adelaide patted his hand. "You came when it mattered, Tommy. That's what counts." As the evening wound down and Felix helped Adelaide to his car, Granite walked beside them. The spring air was cool, comfortable. Adelaide moved slowly but steadily, her hand secure on Felix's arm. "I heard Philip's trial date was set," she said. "October." "Yes," Felix confirmed. "The prosecutor says it's an airtight case. Between the forged documents, the financial records, and the testimonies, he's looking at serious prison time." Adelaide nodded. "I don't hate him," she said quietly. "He's my son, but what he did was unforgivable. He treated me like an object, like something to be disposed of when I became inconvenient." "You were never inconvenient," Granite said. "You were a person who needed protection, and he failed to provide it." "You didn't fail, though," Adelaide said, stopping to look up at him. "You saw a stranger in trouble and followed me for 67 miles. Why?" Granite thought of his own mother, safe in her care facility, surrounded by staff who genuinely cared for her. He thought of all the elderly people who weren't so lucky, who had no one watching out for them, who became invisible, forgotten, disposable. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply, "and because no one should have to face their worst moments alone." Adelaide squeezed his hand. "The world thinks men like you are dangerous," she said. "They see the leather and the motorcycles and they're afraid. But I've taught enough students to know how to read people, and what I see in you and your brothers is loyalty, honor, protection for those who need it most." She smiled. "Society's afraid of the wrong people." As Felix drove Adelaide home, Granite mounted his motorcycle. The evening was peaceful, the kind of spring night that made you grateful to be alive. He thought about the past 6 months, about how one moment of paying attention had changed everything. Adelaide had been right about one thing. Society did fear the wrong people. They feared the men in leather while predators in suits and ties committed crimes behind closed doors. They feared the rough exterior while missing the cruelty hidden beneath polished appearances. But the Brotherhood knew better. They'd always known better. Their code was simple: protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Show loyalty to those who showed courage. Stand up for those who'd been knocked down. Adelaide Weaver had shown courage at that red light. She'd asked for help from a stranger who society told her to fear. And because she'd had the bravery to reach out, and because Granite had had the wisdom to pay attention, everything had changed. Not every story ended this way. Granite knew that. There were too many elderly people suffering in silence, too many vulnerable people with no one to protect them. But this one story had ended the way it should have, with justice, with family reunited, with an elderly woman safe in her grandson's home, playing dominoes on Saturday afternoons, and attending concerts that celebrated the legacy she'd built, with dignity restored to someone who'd never lost it, only had it stolen from her. As Granite rode home through the spring evening, the highway stretching before him, he thought about the 67 miles that had changed Adelaide's life, about the SOS tapped out in rhythm against a window, about the network of former students who'd rallied to help their teacher when they finally knew she needed them. And he thought about the simple truth that had guided his actions that day, and every day since. Everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves protection. Everyone deserves someone who will follow them 67 miles when they mouth the words, "Help me," at a red light. In a world that too often ignores its most vulnerable, that was the Brotherhood's calling. That was their code. That was who they were. Not the dangerous men society feared, but the protectors that society needed. And Adelaide Weaver, retired music teacher, survivor, beloved grandmother, would tell anyone who listened. On the day her son tried to make her disappear, it was a Hell's Angel who made sure she was seen. If you have enjoyed the story, tell YouTube to send you more stories like this by subscribing to this channel, liking the video, and leaving a comment.